Hi, everybody. I wanted to apologize for not being in class today, but as I said in my email to you, I things have been a little bit hectic with my dad, and I've been a little bit under the weather, so I thought that I would just literally phone it in today. So, our topic for today from Davies' book is chapter 8 on divine simplicity. Now, divine simplicity is actually quite an important topic, philosophically speaking. Theologically speaking, it is probably a little bit less important. But in terms of our concept of what God is, there is a very strong philosophical argument that God is what we would call simple. Now, that seems like a very odd claim the way we use the term simplicity most of the time, because it would suggest that God is somehow like easy to understand or something like that. And that isn't true. What simple here means, though, isn't that God is easy to understand, but that God is not in parts. Okay? So, we are spending a lot of time looking at philosophers from the three major monotheistic religions. And one of the things about that is that those religions all agree on this point, that God is somehow one. Islam says, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is prophet. Judaism says, my dog is barking at me. Uh, you know, I am the Lord your God. Okay, like the Lord alone. Okay. Christianity says I believe in one God. So all of these religions, and that constitutes the vast majority of the people on Earth. All of these religions profess to have one God. Now, what does that mean? Okay, that God is somehow unitary. Well, we're going to be talking about some of God's other attributes over the next couple classes. But for the time being, when we say that God is unitary, that God is simple, what we're saying is that if you took two things, okay, and gave them God's attributes, okay, so God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, God is omnipresent, okay, you couldn't tell them apart, okay, they wouldn't actually be two. Now, why is this? Well, logically speaking, let's talk about omnipresent, because that's something that we're not going to be talking about very much. Okay, that's the idea that God is everywhere. Okay, if Henry, be quiet. Sorry. If God is everywhere, okay, God, like if you had two gods, let's say, okay, they couldn't both be everywhere in the same way, because they'd be in exactly the same spot. So if we say that God is omnipresent, okay, that God is in all places at all times, we're really saying that God is unitary. Similarly, okay, if God is all powerful, okay, that means that God is Henry, be quiet. God is like has all the power that exists. There can only be one God, because if two beings had all power, it would just be one being, because otherwise they could somehow cancel each other out. So in that sense also, like, God is unitary, okay? And so, like, logic, and Aristotle talks about this, Aquinas talks about this, a bunch of philosophers talk about this. The one who I think Davies quotes most effectively is Saint Augustine. Okay, and this is on page 165. The reason why nature is called simple is that it cannot lose any attribute it possesses, that there is no difference between what it is and what it has, and there is, for example, as there is, for example, between a vessel and the liquid it contains, a body and its color, the atmosphere and its light or heat, the soul and its wisdom. None of these is what it contains. The vessel is not the liquid, nor the body the color, nor the atmosphere the light or heat, nor is the soul the same as its wisdom. Okay. As Davy says, God is simple because God is unchangeable. But part of that, like, inability to change is that unity. Okay, and so if you had multiple things that you were gonna call God, they would be like indistinguishable from themselves. Let's take that a step further. For the way Davies talks about this, and for the way the philosophers talk about this, that means that not only is God unitary, but God doesn't have parts. Okay. You couldn't talk about God's love, for example, without talking about God's justice. You couldn't talk about God's mercy without talking about God's power. You couldn't talk about God being atemporal without talking about God being omniscient. All right. So all the things that we might say are part of God are inseparable from each other in a way that, like, things are not inseparable from me, all right, or from you. So, for example, okay, if you can imagine God with a body, all right there, you're messing up because our body can lose things, okay, as my hair frequently demonstrates, all right? Our body can lose things, okay? I can, like, cut my fingernails, and then they are no longer a part of me. And you can see different parts of me, okay? So, like, there is me, and then there is my pinky, all right? My pinky is not me, but it is somehow a part of me, okay? But if my pinky were cut off, I would still be me, okay? That would not be true for God, okay? God doesn't have parts that are distinguishable from each other. In other words, to say that God loves you, okay, is the same as to say that God created you. Is the same to say that God will, like, punish you or cleanse you, or, okay, anything that we could say about God is all kind of at the same time inseparable. Okay. Remember when we talked about God and time, in fact, okay? And I was talking about God being atemporal, okay? And I had that image of the hot air balloon rising up. And that as, like, as God, like, rises higher and higher, he can see the whole timeline. That is very similar to saying, the way Aristotle and Aquinas would put it, that for God, his essence is existence. Okay, remember we talked just a little bit about, metaphysics and essence versus existence and things like that. So here we're specifically talking about God's temporality, and, like, everything God does in that moment in which he exists. Okay, so that God isn't becoming anything. Okay, remember some of the ideas that Aquinas had when he was talking about the cosmological argument. God is the unmoved mover. Okay, God is the uncaused cause. God is uncaused or unmoved or anything like that, unchanging, because God is outside of a system that would allow for change. Because the only thing that allows for change is time. Okay, time allows for change. So if God doesn't experience time, God does not change. Which means that everything God does is done all at once, is done like in his like act of existence. Okay. Now, that is hard, I think, for us to wrap our minds around. So, if we're going to talk about God existing, what we're really saying is that there is no difference for God, okay, in what he did yesterday and what he does tomorrow. Now, it may seem different to us because what God is doing is expressed in different ways from our perspective. But from God's perspective, all of that is happening at the same time. In other words, in this moment, God is creating the universe. And in this moment, God is like destroying the universe, okay? Like they are both happening at the same time for him. And that is part of what we mean by simplicity, okay? That God is simple because God doesn't do one thing and then go do another thing. God does everything all at once, end of story. Okay. And so God's characteristics, if you were to like try and take away justice from God, for example, okay? You couldn't do it because what you would have left would not be what we would call God. Right? But you also couldn't do it because if you were to try and take away justice, you would find that the whole thing would just sort of fall apart, okay? God's attributes, we see them maybe as separate ideas, but for God, they're all part of that like self-expressive like existence that God has. So God doesn't love you more or less at any moment, okay? He is not, he is not like angrier with you yesterday than he is with you today, because all of that's happening at the same time. Now, why is this important? Well, like I said, theologically, this maybe isn't that important. But philosophically, I would argue that it is pretty important because it gives us some insight, I think, into what we mean when we say God. Okay, what that term means, what that idea means. If God is simple, that means that he is, in one sense, very much not like us. People are complicated. People have different facets. But what's the advice that we always give people, and that we are really bad at, actually? And it's to be yourself. Now that's really hard for us because, and I see this with my son, all right? And I bet you guys do this too. But my son is different when he is with just me than he is when he's with my wife. Okay? He acts differently because he has a different relationship with us. He relates to us in different ways. When he's with his classmates, he is different entirely there. So when we say, like, be yourself, well, it's like, well, which self do you want us to be? Do you want me to be the parent or the husband or the professor or the child? Okay. All the different things that I am, I sort of turn one off and turn another one on. And I bet you guys do that too. And in fact, those of you who are freshmen, I bet you had this experience going home over Christmas break, that you saw your friends from home, your friends from high school, and that it was just like old times in one way. Right? But in another way, you guys have changed. Like, you're at different schools. You've developed. Like, you have. All right. And so there's a way when we're with friends from a different part of our life that we get stuck in the past because our lives have now diverged. Now, you guys haven't diverged that much. All right. But I just got an invitation to my 25th high school reunion. All right. It's actually really easy to remember how long I've been out of high school because I graduated in 2000. So whatever year it is, that's how long I've been out. All right. So I got this invitation to my 25th reunion. And, I'm thinking about whether or not I want to go back. And, there's some people I want to see, and there's some people I really don't want to see. But one of the things that I don't really and I think a lot of people feel this way, and I totally feel this way, is that I don't want to see I don't want people to see how I've changed. I've put on so much weight and I've lost so much hair and I have gray and I'm all right. But then I think about all my classmates, okay, and Courtney Thompson, who just was the cutest girl in my class, and freckles and all that stuff, and she's had 3 children now, and she's a middle-aged mom, and I don't know that I really want to think of Courtney Thompson as having changed, as being different, okay? And I certainly don't want her to see how much I've changed and how different I am. And so we have there is this difficulty that we have in being ourselves, because who we are changes depending on where we are, who we're with, what age we are. That's not true for God. Okay. God is always himself, always perfectly himself, in a way that I think we don't really understand, because we're not capable of doing that. And part of this is because God is outside of time. So God doesn't change the way, God isn't losing his hair. God isn't getting fatter or skinnier or older or younger, okay? None of that is true for God, okay? Because he's not experiencing time the way we are. But, like I said, and I want to go back to this point because, even if it seems like I'm wandering around a little bit, this is really why I think this is philosophically important. God, in this idea, it's not that he is incapable of kind of reacting or interacting with us. Okay. It's that on the contrary, God is always interacting and influencing us. Okay. Part of this, and this is something that I remember when I had him as a professor, Davies talked about, and I remember trying to wrap my mind around this, but it's true in some way. Okay. Every moment of our existence, if you view God as the creator, every moment we rely on God to create us. Because if he didn't create us, then we wouldn't be here. And because God is outside of time, that is happening right now. And so if you think about miracles, or if you think about, anything that happens, which happens through the power of God, that's always happening through the power of God. So, as you can see, it's Ash Wednesday, okay? So being Christian, I went to church, I got ashes, it's the start of Lent, the penitential season for Christians. I will always be very happy in some ways that I am not Muslim, because Ramadan is way more penitential in some ways than Lent could ever conceive of being. But, all right, I am changing what I'm doing. I'm changing my daily practice, okay? I'm trying to add there's ideas that go with Lent. So you're supposed to pray more, and you're supposed to fast more, and you're supposed to give more money to the poor. And so, like, those are all part of, like, what I'm doing, and it's a change in my routine. Okay? God doesn't change his routine because God doesn't have a routine. So God is constantly creating us, like, both in the universe and also, like, our souls, like, our being. Okay? God is constantly loving us, because if he loves us ever at any point in our lives, he loves us at all points, because he only has one point. So the things that God does, philosophically speaking, are simple and can't be extricated from each other. Maybe putting this in a different way, for people who have a scientific bent. If you think about the way we classify animals, okay, it's called taxonomy. But if you think about the way we classify animals, and we have the five kingdoms, and then we have vertebrates and invertebrates, and cold-blooded and hot-blooded, and mammals, and and I'm looking at my dog, who is now sitting at my feet sighing, and like, Henry is a Portuguese water dog, and he's not a different breed of dog. Okay. All of those classifications get us down to, like, what we are, in essence, what we are internally, what is, like, that thing which is us, or in Henry's case, that thing which is Henry. Okay. Henry, yes, you're a good dog, Henry. Henry is, like, existing as a specific thing. But there's other Portuguese water dogs out there. There are, like, a step up from that, just other dogs out there. A step up from that, there's other canines. And step up from that, there's other, mammals. A step up from that, there's, like, other, like, hot-blooded animals, and so on and so forth, okay? And so, like, he is just one example, okay? Just as, like, I am just one example of, like, a human being. But God is all examples. So there's not more than one, okay? God, like, if God were, like, a kingdom or a genus or a species, okay, he would fit every category in that genus or species or kingdom, okay? So there's no difference, okay? There's no other individuals. And within that, okay, for Henry, he has, like, white and black hair. Okay, so, like, that's the color of his hair. He has, like, paws. He has a red tongue. He has, like, there's all these qualities that he has. Well, the qualities that we would say God has, you couldn't say that God's hair, if God had hair, was different than his paws if God had paws. Okay, there wouldn't be that differentiation. Now, getting back to why I think this is philosophically important, it's philosophically important because I think it hints, at least in part, on our own insignificance. Okay, as human beings, we are, like, far less significant than I think we feel most times. Because under this philosophical conception, we rely on God for everything. For every moment of our existence, we rely on him creating. For every moment of our existence, we rely on God loving or forgiving, or all the things that we look for to God. So if God exists, God is unitary, God is simple, God is always perfectly expressing who he is. Not different aspects of who he is, but every way that he is, in a way that we don't. Okay? God is always himself, never just a part of himself. And I think actually this also maybe heads towards one of the big philosophical questions. So one of the big philosophical questions is what is the purpose of life, okay? What does it mean to be human? What is it okay? And I think in doing that, we're always searching for the infinite. We're always searching for something that can complete us. Okay. That's what relationships are about, right? Okay. You are looking for somebody to be what do people who are married sometimes call themselves it's my other half or my better half. All right. But the thing is, and if any of you have been in relationships, you know that the other person also has limitations, that they're not perfect. They may complete part of us, but they don't fully complete us. Because nothing does. A relationship ends. Somebody dies. Okay? Somebody, you have a fight, or you have a disagreement, or, the other person is just working and they're not there for you when you need them. Whatever it is that makes us imperfect, okay, and the people around us imperfect. We are searching for that thing that will be perfect. But whatever is perfect almost has to be simple. Not because complexity is a bad thing, but because in order for something to truly be able to complete us, it has to fulfill everything that might be missing within us. And I think the argument for God being simple is that is the way God fulfills us. Because if he were able to be broken up into parts, then it would be possible for us to only have a part of God, or this one aspect. And that wouldn't totally fulfill us, because we need all of it. And so by God being simple, he can fill in everything. Not just this one need, but all our needs. And so, what are we searching for? Why do we get so frustrated when we find, this is something, I'm sure you have a memory of your parents being bad parents. Okay. Or a moment where you realize that, gee, my dad isn't perfect, or gee, my mom isn't perfect. I remember with my son, the way he looked at me when he was 4 and thought that I had all the answers, and how he looks at me now and doesn't think I have any of the answers, okay? And neither of those things are right, but but that loss of, we have this reassurance that our parents can, do everything for us, can fix every problem. And the moment they can't, and we realize they can't, we lose a little bit of our innocence. But by God being simple, he can always fill in that stuff, because there's no limits. Yeah. The argument, okay, the argument that is often made against divine simplicity has to do with change. Okay. And so as Davies gives one example on page 170 from Richard Creel, an absolutely perfect being will have the power of agency, that is, to be able intentionally to cause things to happen. But for an agent intentionally to cause something to happen, which was not happening, requires that he was not willing it and then began to will it. But to change from not willing something to willing it is to change. Therefore, in order to have this power of agency, an individual must be able to change. Therefore, God must be able to change. Therefore, God must be mutable. Okay, or in other words, changeable. Here's the problem with that. Okay, that is again from our perspective. Okay, that God always, is changing in order to respond to our needs. Whereas what Davies would argue, and what kind of more traditional theology would argue, is that God intends from all eternity to do what God does when he does it. So God is in that moment outside of time, where he does everything, which means that he intends everything, and it happens for us when and where God wants it. So, as somebody who believes in God, I find this like a particularly appealing idea, because I love the idea that if I'm praying to God, okay, the way God answers my prayer is the way God has been answering my prayer for all eternity. And that's a cool thought for me. It's also a difficult thought, okay? It's difficult to, like I said, to wrap our minds around because we're so used to living in time. But if you take the time factor out, it's not that God needs to change, it's that we are changing and God is like acting throughout all time in response to those changes. So that doesn't mean actually, and this is interesting, we can still affect God, but we are not changing God, because we are not changing him from one moment to another. We are like, what we do changes God kind of for all time. So it's not really a change from God's perspective, because that's just the way he is. So if I pray, I remember when I was a little kid, I prayed for a little sister, okay? And I got a little sister, and, maybe I shouldn't have prayed for her, but, okay? I love Mary, but she is not, we are not simpatico. She went to Springfield College. So my sister, like, I prayed for her, okay? And if it was God that answered that prayer and, like, sent my little sister and created my little sister, like, God answered that because of my prayer, but also outside of time. So God always intended from forever and ever, like, always intended to answer that prayer. So it wasn't that God changed his mind. He didn't change his mind. It just looked that way from my perspective, that like one moment I didn't have a little sister and then I did. Okay. So apart from the fact that like people disagree with whether or not God can change, I think most people reject this from a Christian standpoint because of the Christian idea of the Holy Trinity. So that God is both Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I have a very brief answer to that here, speaking as somebody who is a Christian. Okay. The Holy Trinity doesn't make any sense, okay? It is considered to be the greatest mystery of the Christian religion, how God can be both three and at the same time one, and I have no idea how that works, and neither does anybody else. So, does that challenge divine simplicity? Well, If you are somebody who emphasizes the three part of the Holy Trinity as opposed to the one part of the Holy Trinity, maybe it does. But if you emphasize the mystery part of the Holy Trinity, then just don't think about it. So like people who are like really interested in like, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit tend to reject this divine simplicity because they like can't wrap their minds around it. But what they really can't wrap their minds around is like how the Holy Trinity works. And believe me, I don't know how the Holy Trinity works. The philosopher slash theologian who wrote most about the Holy Trinity is Saint Augustine of Hippo. And his advice to people was not to write about the Holy Trinity and not to talk about it for more than a couple minutes, because at some point you are going to say something which is entirely wrong, and so you should just shut up. So, like, for a Christian, it's like, accept the Holy Trinity, don't really think about it too much. And that is honestly what I try to do, because if I think about it too much, I give myself a headache. But I think that that is actually the largest objection to this, because from like a Muslim perspective, for example, God being unitary and simple makes perfect theological sense, and arguably also from a Jewish perspective. So it's specifically Christians who have trouble with this, despite the fact that this is like what the vast majority of Christian saints have believed and taught throughout the ages. So, you don't have to buy into divine simplicity any more than you have to buy into God. But there's a really good argument in my mind that if you're going to buy into God, you are also buying into simplicity. Because for God to be anything but simple would mean that God has parts. And if God has parts, then, you could take those parts away and, you know, leave you something with less than God, and that doesn't make sense. So, I really subscribe to divine simplicity. If you don't, or if you have questions, we can talk about that on Friday. Thank you very much. I hope this wasn't too confusing. I've realized as I'm talking that it is perhaps more confusing to talk about than it is for me just to accept internally. And so I apologize if I have confused you at all. All right. Thanks very much.